So what about offshore development? When we talk about communication, this is sort of stereotypically one of the knocks on offshore and even nearshore development is challenges with communication, or challenges. And when I say communication, let's be clear that that's not just about being able to speak English. Quite a few developers globally are able to speak English well now. They can communicate at least at that level. But this is really about tacit knowledge. It's about vertical specific knowledge quite often. So it's not enough to know how to express oneself in a particular language, human language, but it's how to express oneself in the vernacular of a particular industry. So do you know health, care jargon in the U.S.? Do you know finance industry jargon in the U.S. or insurance industry jargon in the U.S.? Whatever that may be, that's the actual language you oftentimes need to know, which frankly, a lot of domestic developers don't know that. It requires specific experience. And then even beyond that, there's the tacit knowledge that's just sort of specific to a culture and to a locale. So all of those factors play into quite often a reduction in performance from an offshore perspective. What we kind of can model that and see is that instead of seeing, 0.5 being the communication sort of signal loss ratio for an average developer, we might be down here at 0.3 for an average offshore dev. We'll call that offshore dev. Now, if you're wondering why, like if you've ever wondered, or if you've ever heard of these boondoggle stories, and I've personally been involved with them, I've seen them myself at large companies, like why is it that so-and-so Fortune 500 company or big governmental entity or whoever has 1,000-person team offshore? Like how could they need that many developers? Like what on earth do they do? How is it that they're not productive? I'll show you, again, we can look at this mathematically. Why are they not productive? The answer comes from the following. The way those large teams are typically structured, the way large companies are structured, there are many layers. And so you are playing an insane game of telephone. So this poor offshore dev is over here. Now I empathize with them. They typically have, a local team lead. So then they've got to talk to their team lead. And then oftentimes there's also an offshore PM. So someone who is supposed to be figuring it all out with them, for them. And then there's an onshore equivalent. So this, I'll show you just the most absurd arrangement I had ever seen. So this is not, I'm not going to say this is typical, but you'll see it in big companies and in poorly run projects. You'll have an onshore PM, and then you'll have, well, actually I've inverted this. You'll have an onshore kind of tech lead, sometimes inserted here. And then an onshore PM type person. So I'm not done yet. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 hops. And then you've got the actual, let's say, customer success team of the big company. So the specific person who has made the ask. And then finally, they are the ones talking to the end customer. So now what do we have? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got 6 hops. So 6 hops through this chain. So that's kind of insane. Let's assume for a moment that everybody is an overall average communicator, at 0.5. That is really, that's taking into account the fact, we're kind of averaging out. Like we could be really optimistic and say, oh, everybody is a great communicator and, they're up at 80%. But including all of the cultural challenges, of offshore, including all of that, everything we just talked about, let's be optimistic, say that they're at 0.5. So if they're at 0.5, if everybody's at 0.5, this is 0.5 to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th power, right? Or essentially just dividing by 2 6 times. So what do you get there? Well, you get 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. So this is 1/64th. So 1/64th, somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.015 or 6, something like that. Somewhere in the neighborhood, roughly. So 0.016. That's insane. That means that from the original customer's ask, something like 1.6% of that made it all the way across the chain. So, you might say, oh, you're insane, Praveen. I mean, like, this is nonsense. You're just like making a straw man argument here. But we can look back at projects, major projects. I mean, healthcare.gov, I think, was done primarily in the United States. So that's not a good example, but it is an example of a chain that's deep. There are many offshore projects, again, where we see literally 1,000 developer workforces on the other side. How is it that they managed to get outperformed by a startup team? This is part of the reason that they get outperformed by a startup team. It's because of this, which is really fundamentally a communication problem. This developer is not so terrible, but when you've larded it up with all of these layers, you're killing your productivity. It should be noted that if you try to plug in and directly connect with this developer, that chances are you're still going to experience a lower than average. And I was generous here. You're gonna experience a lower than average productivity rate because of that communication delta, which, when you think about like differentials in prices, with offshore and, depending on the country, the situation, maybe it's half the cost, maybe it's a third of the cost, maybe it's a quarter of the cost. This differential eats up virtually all of that. And, there's that saying, you get what you pay for. That's part of why, again, communication skill matters so much and how it impacts offshore teams even more greatly, and part of that is also due to the excessive layers.